Yeah, great. So greetings. So today I want to talk about continuity over a seam. So assume in this example that this spline defines the midplane of a surface that's going to be mirrored over. And so it's a symmetrical part. So instead of doing the entire part, you want to do one half in this scenario and then mirror the other half over. So I call this a seam, and I am very picky with my students about making sure they have good continuity over a seam. So again, this is primarily for my students to make sure they understand my expectations for seams. And I'm going to use the multi-section surface tool for this in CATIA's GSD workbench. And my goal is to have G2 continuity over this seam. So let's begin. Let's look at what I have here. So what I have here for my seam line is a spline through a point to another point, and if I go into this spline, you will see that I have the first point going G2 continuity with just a normal tension of 1 to the x-axis of my axis system, and I have no continuity to define on the second point. So notice I've got G2 continuity there. So my goal is G2 continuity for this surface. I'm going to make sure that I have G2 continuity all the way around, regardless of whether it's going to affect the final surface or not. So I want G2 continuity on everything. And I tell my students, if you want good surfaces, you've got to have good wireframe. So if I'm looking for G2 continuity on surfaces, make sure your wireframe elements have G2 continuity on them. This is going over the seam, so maybe not as important here, but I'm still going to set it at G2, which is curvature continuity. So I've got that set. So let's go and look at this one. This one is more important because this is going to define a side that's going to be mirrored over. So let's go to my first point, which is going in the Y direction, and I've got it going tangent right now to the Y-axis of my axis system. So I'm going to make sure I set that to G2, which is curvature. So I've got G2 now on this wireframe element going over on to the y-axis, and it will be going over the seam, which is what I'm looking for. So let me put in my next two splines. So notice I'm just going to put this in first, and then I'll go back. So notice there's nothing here directly that I can go, at least lined up here, that I can go G2. But I can come up here and still use the y-axis of my axis system. And I can set that to be, and notice I'm doing from curve too, and I can do that to be curvature and then select this point. So now this is, again, as well, G2 over this curve. And then finally for this one, not as important for mirroring over the seam, but I'm still going to be intentional with my continuity, but I'm going to make up something here. So let's say that it's going to the y-axis, if I can select that here. Okay, and then to this point. And let me set that to be G2. Okay, fine. Now, so I've got my curves in. And I want to do a loft between this curve and this spline, and I want to use these as guides. But I'm not done. So I'm going to make sure that not only are my curves have G2 continuity, but my surfaces have something to reference for G2 continuity. So I'm going to create a reference surface, what I refer to as a reference surface. So in other words, it's a surface that's not going to be part of my final surface explicitly, but I'm going to use it with my final surface to ensure I have continuity over the seam. So I'm going to do the extrude tool for this. So with the extrude tool, I'm going to take my spline, and my direction is going to be along the x-axis of my, that is the y-axis of my current axis system. And it doesn't really matter how far I extrude it out there so I can see it. And so my spline is being extruded along the y-axis. Now, the other ones I don't really care about. It just depends on what the final design is going to look like. But this is the main setup I have for doing seams. I've got a seam spline, and I've got my curves that go, in this case, we want to call it normal to that seam spline. That's going to be mirrored over. So I want to make sure they have the level of continuity that I want coming into the seam. In this case, it's G2, and I have G2 coming into this, and I have my reference surface. So I'm going to create my surface now as a loft to begin with, and then let's see what it looks like. So I'm going to go to loft. I'm going to select, this is one section. I'm going to look at my closing direction. Looks good. And when it comes to this one, look at my closing direction. That looks good. And then let's go to guides. So for my guide, I'm going to select here. And then I'm going to jump over and add this as support, making sure, and this is where I want my curvature continuity. I've got my curvature continuity there. And then for my next spline, don't have to worry about that as far as how my design is looking now. So I've got preview that, and then make sure I go to tangency then curvature for my coupling mode, and looks good. So all that's created. Now reference surface, so I can hide that. Notice how I put my surface in a separate geometric set. Typically I'd put my wireframe elements in a wireframe geometric set. I guess I'll do that. I forgot to do that to begin with. I tell my students I forget to do stuff like that, and sometimes I have to pause, go back, and reorganize my data. So there we go. So notice I've got my wireframe elements in a wireframe geometric set. I've got my reference elements, in this case the one reference surface in a reference geometric set, and then the surface that I'm working on is going to be in its own geometric set with other surfaces that will be eventually union together. So I want to take this surface and I'm going to do a mirror on it. So let's find the mirror tool. It's on the operations toolbar, so I'm going to perform a mirror. And I pre-selected that, and so my reference will be the XZ plane. So there's my mirrored element, and for completion, let's join this together. So pre-select, the join tool is on the operations toolbar, and join those two together. And now I'm going to, the reference surface is already hidden, so let's hide the wireframe geometry. Yeah, so now let's do a zebra stripe analysis on this. So I like to go to the freestyle workbench in CATIA and select the isophotes analysis. You can find it on the analysis toolbar. It's probably behind the environmental mapping analysis. And like I said, the name is isophotes something mapping analysis. So I'm going to pre-select my join. I'm going to select the tool. So the results are nice. So notice I've got smooth zebra stripes across the surface. It's looking exactly the way I would like to see it look. Let's also, I'm going to hide that. Let's also look at a porcupine analysis on it. So porcupine analysis on this end, and that's showing G2 continuity. And let's throw one. Let's see what this looks like on this end. Again, G2 continuity. So those look well, and so I hope that helps.